There existed a particular cruelty reserved for those who had been shaped into perfection, only to be discarded when their purpose became inconvenient, who had been molded through systematic brutality into instruments of death and loyalty, only to discover that such dedication meant nothing when political calculations required different mathematics about worth and expendability. For the woman who no longer remembered her name, this cruelty had become the only constant in existence that had been reduced to fragments of muscle memory and instinctive responses that operated beyond conscious control or rational understanding. She possessed no recollection of the years that had carved precision into her movements, no awareness of training that had transformed natural omega gentleness into lethal capability that could end lives with efficiency that spoke of systematic conditioning rather than natural talent. The memories had been locked away through methods that preserved functionality while erasing identity, leaving behind weapons that could be deployed without the complications that might arise from personal attachment or moral consideration about targets and objectives. What remained was silence that spoke of control rather than emptiness, stillness that suggested predatory patience rather than submissive acceptance, presence that commanded attention through absence of sound rather than demanding recognition through typical omega behavior that sought comfort and protection through social connection and community belonging that had been systematically eliminated from her understanding of appropriate survival strategies. 24 years old according to physical development that suggested peak conditioning and optimal capability, she carried scars that told stories no historian would record, marks that served as testament to transformation that had required destruction of original identity in favor of purpose that transcended individual preference or personal comfort to serve objectives that operated beyond norm. Moral consideration about appropriate treatment and human dignity. The pack that had raised her possessed no understanding of what she had become during years when her absence from their territory had been explained through vague references to specialized training and advanced education that would serve community purposes upon her return. They knew only that she had departed as frightened child and returned as eerily silent young woman, whose presence made even alpha wolves uncomfortable through methods they couldn't identify or understand. Her muteness had been interpreted as trauma response rather than strategic choice, evidence of weakness rather than indication of control that operated beyond normal social expectations about communication and appropriate interaction with authority figures whose commands had shaped her existence according to principles that prioritized effectiveness over emotional comfort or personal expression. That might interfere with operational requirements, but silence that had been carefully cultivated through systematic conditioning served multiple purposes that extended beyond simple concealment to encompass tactical advantages that most individuals never developed or recognized as useful for survival in environments where sound could mean death, and visibility might compromise objectives that required completion, regardless of personal cost or mood. Consideration about methods employed. When territorial disputes had required resolution through diplomatic arrangements that balanced competing claims against strategic necessity, her pack's leadership had discovered that political convenience sometimes demanded sacrifices that challenged their understanding of appropriate loyalty and community responsibility. Peace treaties occasionally required payment in forms that transcended monetary consideration to encompass human resources that could be transferred between territories according to calculations that served broader objectives. The decision to offer her as tribute had been presented as pragmatic choice rather than betrayal. Strategic necessity that served community survival through individual sacrifice that honored greater good over personal circumstances. Her silence had been interpreted as acceptance rather than recognition of inevitability, submission rather than assessment of options that revealed no alternative to compliance with arrangements that had been finalized without her consultation or consent. But what they had actually transferred was weapon whose capabilities operated beyond their understanding. Instrument of death that had been shaped through systematic brutality into effectiveness that transcended normal omega limitations to encompass lethal potential that could reshape territorial balance through methods that served different mathematics about power and appropriate resolution of conflict between competing authorities. The rival territory that had received her as peace offering possessed no awareness of what had been placed within their borders, viewing her acquisition as symbolic gesture rather than introduction of factor that could destabilize established arrangements through demonstration of capability that challenged assumptions about appropriate sources of strength and legitimate methods for maintaining her. Rhetorical control. They saw Omega female whose silence suggested weakness rather than control, whose stillness indicated submission rather than predatory patience, whose presence represented political trophy rather than potential threat that could eliminate established leadership through methods that operated beyond their understanding of appropriate conflict resolution and diplomatic security arrangements. Tonight, they would discover the difference between symbol and reality, between tribute and weapon, between Omega gentleness and conditioned lethality that had been waiting for circumstances that would activate responses that operated beyond conscious control to serve objectives that transcended individual choice or moral consideration about appropriate methods for achieving survival when diplomatic. I failed and violence became necessary. The forest that bordered both territories would become battlefield, where assumptions about weakness and strength would be tested through direct confrontation, where silence would prove more dangerous than sound, where Omega-shaped shadow would demonstrate that appearance often concealed reality, that challenged every comfortable assumption about power and its appropriate exercise through force wrath, rather than negotiation. Some transformations required crisis to reveal their completion, and tonight would determine whether years of systematic conditioning had created instrument capable of independent operation when circumstances required action beyond diplomatic arrangement or political consideration about appropriate methods for resolving conflict through force that honored different principles about survival in the rhetorical control. The pack that had abandoned her would learn too late that they had not discarded weakness, but released weapon whose loyalty had been transferred through betrayal, whose effectiveness would now serve different objectives that operated beyond their understanding or ability to control, through methods they had taught her to employ, without conscious awareness of capability, that transcended normal Omega. Limitations. In darkness, that concealed movement, while revealing intent, silence that had been mistaken for emptiness, would prove its true nature through demonstration of control that operated beyond sound, to encompass death, that spoke with finality, that transcended diplomatic language, or political arrangement about appropriate resolution of territorial dispute, through means that honored different mathematics, about power and its legitimate exercise. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The hemp rope that bound her wrists possessed roughness that spoke of hasty preparation rather than ceremonial significance, practical restraint that reflected her pack's eagerness to complete transaction that would resolve territorial disputes through payment that challenged their understanding of appropriate sacrifice while serving diplomatic objectives that required individual submission to immunity, necessity, and political convenience over personal choice or moral consideration. Behind her, the voices of those who had raised her from childhood faded into distance that measured more than simple geographical separation, words that carried relief rather than regret, as they departed territories where her presence would no longer complicate their understanding of appropriate loyalty and community responsibility through silence that made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't identify or address through normal social interaction. "She'll be dead by morning," Elder Marcus had muttered with satisfaction that suggested his evaluation reflected hope rather than simple prediction about survival probability in territory where Omega females faced systematic hostility from population that viewed such presence as weakness rather than potential advantage for diplomatic arrangement or territorial cooperation. "Rival packs don't coddle damaged goods," had been Second Beta Williams' contribution to conversation that treated her transfer as administrative matter rather than individual experience, assessment that reduced her worth to whatever others were willing to acknowledge when her presence became problematic for political stability and community harmony, that required clear distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. The casual dismissal of her survival prospects had revealed their understanding of diplomatic arrangement as disposal method disguised as peace offering, strategy that eliminated problematic individual while maintaining plausible deniability about intentions and appropriate treatment of community members whose circumstances had become inconvenient for established social dynamics and political relationships. But what they had failed to recognize was that silence, which made them uncomfortable, possessed tactical value that extended beyond simple concealment to encompass awareness that operated through observation rather than verbal communication, understanding that processed information through methods that most individuals never developed or recognized as useful for survival in hostile environments. Now, Alone in forests that bordered territories where competing claims created zones of contested authority and systematic violence, she found herself assessing circumstances with clarity that transcended emotional response to betrayal in favor of practical evaluation of options that would determine outcomes according to capability rather than diplomatic arrangement or political expectation about appropriate submission. The ropes had been tied by individuals whose understanding of restraint reflected ceremonial rather than practical purposes, knots that prioritized appearance over effectiveness while providing confidence that security had been achieved through methods that satisfied political requirements without consideration of actual capability or experience, with escape techniques that might render such measure res inadequate for containing individuals whose training exceeded normal expectations. Her fingers found weakness in binding pattern that suggested amateur application of restraint techniques, gaps that allowed circulation while providing leverage points that could be exploited through systematic pressure, applied according to principles that had been carved into muscle memory through conditioning that operated beyond conscious recollection to encompass physical capability that transcended typical omega limitations. The process of liberation required patience rather than force, methodical application of techniques that preserved strength while achieving objectives that served immediate necessity, without alerting potential observers to activity that might compromise tactical advantages gained through apparent submission and strategic concealment of actual capability, until circumstances required different responses. Forest sounds that surrounded her position carried information about wildlife patterns and environmental conditions that suggested normal ecosystem function, rather than presence of patrols or surveillance that might indicate territorial security measures designed to monitor border regions, where diplomatic arrangements required observation of compliance with agreements that affected both communities through individual transfers. But absence of immediate human presence did not guarantee safety in territories where hunting parties operated according to schedules that reflected tactical considerations rather than routine patterns, where pursuit might develop according to information that reached authority figures, whose decisions about appropriate response would determine whether her presence represented diplomatic opportunities, tie or security threat requiring elimination. When freedom returned to her movements through systematic application of techniques that had been preserved through muscle memory despite conscious amnesia about their origin, she found herself capable of assessment that operated beyond normal omega instincts to encompass evaluation that prioritized tactical advantage over emotional comfort or social connection that typically shaped survival strategies for individuals whose circumstances required community protection. The territory that extended around her position possessed characteristics that suggested both opportunity and danger for individual whose presence lacked official authorization, while carrying implications that could affect territorial relationships through methods that served different objectives than diplomatic arrangement had been designed to achieve through political convenience rather than tactical resolution of underlying conflicts. Moving through underbrush with silence that reflected training rather than natural ability, she discovered that her body possessed knowledge that transcended conscious understanding about appropriate techniques for concealment and navigation through hostile environment where sound could attract attention that might prove lethal for individual whose presence violated territorial agreements and challenged assumptions about appropriate behavior. Her progress through forest revealed familiarity with principles that governed effective movement through various terrain types, application of techniques that minimized disturbance while maintaining optimal positioning for observation, and rapid response to threats that might develop according to patrol patterns or random encounters that could compromise security through discovery of unauthorized presence. 20 minutes of careful advancement brought her to elevated position that provided tactical overview of territory that stretched beyond immediate vicinity to encompass strategic considerations about routes and obstacles that would affect potential pursuit while revealing information about defensive arrangements that might indicate territorial security priorities and appropriate methods for avoiding detection. Below her position, campfire light revealed presence of 6 individuals whose equipment and formation suggested patrol unit rather than hunting party, professionals whose responsibility included border security and appropriate response to violations of territorial agreements that governed diplomatic arrangements between competing authorities whose relationships required constant monitoring for compliance with negotiated terms. Their conversation carried across distance with clarity that suggested confidence in territorial control, while revealing information about patrol schedules and communication protocols that would determine response patterns if her presence became known through discovery or reports from sources that might compromise her tactical situation through observation or direct confrontation. "Border's been quiet tonight," observed Warrior, whose voice carried authority that suggested leadership responsibility within patrol structure, assessment that indicated normal operational conditions, rather than heightened security that might reflect awareness of diplomatic transfer, or expectation of complications that could arise from territorial agreement and individual placement arrangements. "Too quiet," replied second voice with tone that suggested professional suspicion about environmental conditions that exceeded normal parameters, awareness that tactical situations often developed through subtle indicators, rather than obvious threats that challenge territorial security through conventional methods that could be anticipated through standard defensive procedures. "Omega sent on the wind," announced Third Warrior, with certainty that sent shock through her system, as recognition dawned that concealment which had seemed adequate might prove insufficient against enhanced senses that operated beyond normal human capability to detect presence through biological markers that couldn't be completely suppressed through positioning or environmental factors. The identification of her presence through scent detection revealed limitations in concealment techniques that had been designed for different operational environments, methods that proved inadequate when confronted by enhanced senses that operated according to shifter capabilities rather than normal human sensory limitations that had shaped original training assumptions. "Fresh," confirmed fourth voice with growing interest that suggested transition from routine patrol to active investigation, development of situation that would require different tactical responses than simple avoidance or concealment that had been adequate for maintaining security during initial movement through territorial boundaries. "Moving east toward the river crossing," added Fifth Warrior with analysis that revealed tracking capability that threatened her tactical situation through systematic identification of movement patterns and directional assessment that could predict future positioning according to terrain features and logical route selection based on available options. Around her position, forest began to feel less like concealment and more like hunting ground, where prey had been identified by predators whose capability exceeded her understanding of appropriate countermeasures, while their coordination suggested professional military training rather than casual territorial defense that might provide opportunities for evasion through standard techniques. But as patrol members began systematic coordination of pursuit that would eliminate her advantages through superior numbers and territorial familiarity, something shifted within her consciousness like door opening onto rooms she had forgotten existed, revealing access to capability that had been waiting for circumstances that required responses beyond normal Omega survival strategies. Her hands found balance that spoke of training, that transcended conscious recollection, while her posture adjusted according to principles that prioritized lethal efficiency over personal safety, transformation that activated without conscious decision, through recognition that survival required different mathematics than diplomatic submission or community acceptance had previously demanded. The woman who possessed no memory of becoming weapon discovered that conditioning operated beyond conscious awareness when circumstances activated responses that had been carved into reflexes through systematic brutality that served objectives she couldn't remember choosing, but whose effectiveness would soon be demonstrated through methods that challenged every assumption about Omega capability. An appropriate resistance to superior force. Below, patrol members continued coordination of pursuit that would test whether silence represented weakness or control, whether stillness indicated submission or predatory patience, whether Omega appearance concealed reality that could reshape territorial balance through demonstration of capability that operated beyond their understanding of appropriate threat assessment and tactical preparation. In darkness that concealed movement while revealing intent, the abandoned tribute was about to teach lessons about assumption and reality that would echo through territories whose diplomatic arrangements had failed to account for variables that transcended normal calculation about power and its appropriate distribution through force, rather than negotiation that served political convenience over PI. Practical resolution of underlying conflicts. The transformation that occurred within her consciousness possessed quality of inevitability rather than conscious choice, systematic activation of responses that had been conditioned through methods that operated beyond memory, to encompass reflexes that prioritized lethal efficiency over personal safety or moral consideration about appropriate methods for resolving conflicts that threatened Indy. visual survival through superior numbers and territorial advantage. Her descent from elevated position toward patrol formation below demonstrated fluidity that spoke of training that had been carved into muscle memory through repetition, that transcended conscious recollection, movement that minimized sound while maintaining optimal positioning for engagement, that would serve tactical objectives through methods designed to eliminate threats with precision, that hone, forward effectiveness over mercy or diplomatic consideration. The first warrior never saw her approach. His attention focused on tracking patterns that suggested movement toward river crossing, while his position provided security for teammates whose coordination had been designed to contain individual whose capabilities were assumed to reflect normal omega limitations rather than conditioned lethality that could operate beyond their understanding of appropriate threat assessment. When her hand closed over his mouth while blade found insertion point between vertebrae that served spinal column, his death occurred with silence that preserved tactical advantage while demonstrating precision that spoke of systematic education in anatomy and appropriate methods for achieving immediate incapacitation through techniques that honored efficiency over prolonged struggle that might compromise operational security. The body settled to forest floor without sound that might alert remaining patrol members to development of situation that had transformed routine border security into lethal encounter, while her position provided concealment that allowed assessment of targets whose formation had been designed for pursuit rather than defense against threat that operated through methods they hadn't anticipated. "Marcus?" called patrol leader with growing concern as silence stretched beyond normal communication intervals, voice carrying tension that suggested transition from confident pursuit to uncertainty about teammate whose position should have provided regular updates according to coordination protocols that governed professional military operations. Her movement toward second position demonstrated understanding of tactical principles that prioritized elimination of threats according to capability rather than hierarchy, recognition that patrol effectiveness required neutralization of individuals whose skills posed greatest danger to operational success, while maintaining advantage through surprise that would be lost once engagement became obvious. Oust to surviving members. The archer, whose responsibility included long-range support, died with arrow knocked but never released, his throat opened by strike that severed vocal cords while preventing reflexive shot that might have alerted remaining teammates to presence of threat that operated beyond their understanding of appropriate defensive measures or tactical response to individual whose capability exceeded official assessment. "Position report," demanded patrol leader with authority that reflected growing awareness that normal communication patterns had been disrupted through unknown factors. Command that received no response from positions that should have maintained security, according to established protocols that governed border patrol operations and appropriate coordination methods. Her approach toward Third Warrior revealed understanding of environmental factors that could be exploited for tactical advantage, using shadows and natural concealment that forest provided while maintaining awareness of remaining threats, whose positions determined optimal engagement sequence, according to principles that prioritize systematic elimination over random violence that might compromise operational effectiveness. The blade work that ended Third Life demonstrated precision that spoke of education in human anatomy and appropriate methods for achieving death through techniques that honored speed over mercy, while positioning preserved tactical advantage through concealment that prevented remaining patrol members from assessing actual nature of threat they faced through direct observation of engagement method. "Contact!" screamed Fourth Warrior, as recognition dawned that silence from teammates indicated systematic elimination rather than communication failure, his voice carrying alarm that transformed tactical situation from concealed engagement to open combat, where advantage would be determined through capability rather than surprise that had served initial operational phases. But his alarm came too late to preserve patrol effectiveness. While her position provided opportunity for engagement that would demonstrate whether professional military training could compensate for individual capability that operated beyond their understanding of appropriate threat assessment and tactical preparation for encounters that exceeded normal operational parameters. The combat that followed revealed systematic education in principles that governed lethal engagement, application of techniques that had been conditioned through repetition that carved effectiveness into reflexes while eliminating hesitation or moral consideration that might compromise operational success through emotional interference with tactical decision-making processes. Fourth warrior possessed combat experience that reflected professional training and battlefield exposure, capabilities that should have provided advantage over individual Omega, whose appearance suggested limitations rather than lethal potential. But his techniques had been designed for engagement with opponents whose capabilities operated within normal parameters, rather than conditioned responses that transcended typical limitations. When her blade found opening in his defense that reflected systematic analysis of combat patterns and appropriate exploitation of tactical vulnerabilities, his death demonstrated that experience provided insufficient protection against training that had been designed to eliminate threats regardless of their capability or professional background, through methods that honored effectiveness over fair engagement. Fifth warrior's attempt at tactical withdrawal revealed understanding that individual engagement had proven inadequate for containing threat, whose capability exceeded patrol assessment, recognition that survival required different strategy than direct confrontation that had proven lethal for teammates, whose professional training had been insufficient for encounter with conditioned lethality. But forest terrain that provided concealment also limited escape routes, available to individual whose position had been compromised through engagement, that revealed location, while demonstrating capability that made pursuit inadvisable through methods that honored tactical reality over pride or professional obligation to complete mission objectives regardless of cost. Her pursuit demonstrated understanding of tracking principles that operated beyond normal social skills to encompass predatory instincts that had been shaped through systematic conditioning, application of techniques that maintained contact with target while preventing escape through methods that exploited environmental advantages and superior capability for movement through hostile terrain. The final kill occurred at river crossing, where warriors' attempt to ford water had been anticipated through tactical assessment that predicted logical route selection, positioning that allowed engagement under circumstances that prevented escape while demonstrating understanding of terrain features that could be exploited for operational advantage. When Silence returned to forest clearing, where 6 professionals had been eliminated through systematic application of lethal techniques, she found herself standing among results that challenged her understanding of personal capability while revealing training that had been preserved through conditioning that operated beyond conscious memory to encompass deadly effectiveness. The bodies that surrounded her position served as testament to transformation that had occurred beyond her awareness, evidence of conditioning that had carved lethality into reflexes, while erasing memory of process that had shaped Omega gentleness into a weapon whose capability transcended normal limitations through methods that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate power and its distribution. Blood that stained forest floor reflected light from patrol's abandoned campfire with patterns that spoke of precision rather than random violence, systematic elimination that had been achieved through techniques that honored efficiency over mercy, while demonstrating training that exceeded anything normal Omega education would have provided through conventional methods or community instruction. But even as evidence of capability surrounded her position, awareness of transformation remained fragmented through amnesia that preserved functionality while concealing process that had shaped her existence. According to objectives she couldn't remember choosing or understanding through conscious reflection about purposes that had required such systematic destruction of original identity. The scent of death that would attract scavengers while alerting other patrols to development of situation that required investigation reminded her that tactical success created new complications that would determine whether current advantage could be maintained through continued concealment, or would require different strategies that honored immediate necessity over long-term planning. Moving away from scene that would eventually attract attention that could compromise her security, she discovered that forest, which had seemed threatening, now felt familiar in ways that suggested previous experience with similar environments, understanding that operated beyond conscious recollection to encompass navigational instincts that had been shaped through systematic exposure to hostile rittery. As dawn approached with light that would reveal evidence while attracting investigation that could develop into pursuit by forces whose capability might exceed single patrol, she found herself processing tactical situation with clarity that transcended emotional response to violence in favor of practical assessment, that prioritized survival through methods that honored effectiveness over moral consideration. The Omega, who possessed no memory of becoming weapon, had demonstrated that conditioning operated beyond consciousness when circumstances required responses that transcended normal limitations, while forests that had witnessed systematic elimination would carry forward testimony about capability that challenged assumptions regarding appropriate power and its exercise through force rather than diplomatic arrangement. Behind her, evidence of lethality would soon attract attention from authority, whose investigation would reveal that territorial agreement had introduced variable that exceeded diplomatic calculation, factor that could reshape balance through demonstration of capability that operated beyond their understanding of appropriate threat assessment and tactical preparation for encounters with conditioning. Effectiveness. The abandoned tribute was no longer simply individual whose presence represented political convenience or diplomatic trophy, but weapon whose loyalty had been transferred through betrayal, while capability remained intact through conditioning that served different objectives than community harmony or territorial cooperation that had shaped original placement arrangements. In growing light that would soon expose evidence while attracting investigation, she moved toward territory that stretched beyond immediate vicinity, with understanding that survival required different calculations than diplomatic submission had previously demanded. Recognition that conditioning had preserved options that operated beyond normal Omega limitations through training, whose origins remained hidden behind amnesia that protected capability while concealing purpose. The discovery of 6 bodies arranged in tactical formation that spoke of systematic elimination rather than random violence would attract investigation that operated beyond normal border security protocols to encompass territorial assessment of threats that exceeded diplomatic calculation, while evidence patterns suggested capability that challenged fundamental assumptions about appropriate power, distribution, and tactical preparation for encounters with unknown variables. 3 hours after sunrise, when scout patrols found scene that revealed precision techniques applied with lethal efficiency, reports began flowing toward authority, whose responsibility included territorial security and appropriate response to developments that threatened established arrangements through demonstration of capability that operated beyond their understanding of legitimate threat assessment and defensive preparation. By midday, Alpha King Darius Grimwald himself stood among evidence that challenged his understanding of recent territorial agreements and diplomatic arrangements that had been designed to maintain balance, without introducing factors that could destabilize established relationships through methods that served unknown objectives, requiring different mathematical assessment of power and appropriate distribution of authority. The bodies displayed wounds that spoke of professional training, rather than desperate survival responses. Systematic application of techniques that honored anatomical precision over random violence, while demonstrating education that exceeded anything normal community instruction would have provided through conventional methods or typical Omega development programs designed for social integration. Blade work, observed Commander Hayes with professional assessment that reflected military experience and tactical education, sufficient for recognizing evidence of systematic conditioning rather than natural capability. Analysis that suggested presence of individual whose training transcended normal parameters through methods that served objectives beyond typical community purposes or diplomatic arrangement. Precise insertion points, continued Captain Morrison, with growing recognition that wounds reflected understanding of human anatomy and appropriate methods for achieving immediate incapacitation through techniques that honored effectiveness over mercy or prolonged engagement that might compromise operational security through sound or extended struggle. Throat strikes designed to prevent vocal alarm, added Lieutenant Sterling, with analysis that revealed tactical thinking that prioritized concealment over demonstration. Systematic elimination that had been achieved through methods that suggested professional military education, rather than desperate improvisation or random violence that might reflect emotional response to territorial threat. Alpha King Darius examined evidence with attention that reflected growing comprehension that territorial agreement had introduced variable whose significance exceeded diplomatic convenience to encompass strategic implications that could affect regional balance through demonstration of capability that challenged comfortable assumptions about power and its appropriate exercise. The Omega, he said with certainty that transcended doubt about identity, despite absence of direct evidence that linked eliminated patrol to individual, whose transfer had been negotiated through diplomatic channels designed to resolve territorial disputes, without introducing complications that might destabilize established arrangements through unknown factors. She's alive, he continued with analysis that processed tactical evidence through understanding of capability that operated beyond normal assessment parameters, recognition that survival against professional patrol suggested training that exceeded typical Omega limitations, while revealing conditioning that served objectives beyond simple territorial integration or community acceptance. Commander Hayes approached with expression that mixed professional admiration with growing concern about implications that extended beyond immediate tactical situation to encompass questions about appropriate response to individual, whose capability challenged their understanding of legitimate threat assessment and territorial security arrangements. "Your Majesty," he said with careful diplomacy that attempted to balance military assessment with political consideration about appropriate acknowledgement of capability that might compromise comfortable narratives about power distribution and legitimate authority throughout territories that served royal control through established hierarchies and traditional methods. The elimination pattern suggests professional training that exceeds anything normal Omega education would provide. He continued with analysis that honored tactical evidence while avoiding conclusions that might challenge royal authority or comfortable assumptions about appropriate sources of lethal capability within territories that served established order through conventional arrangements. Furthermore, Captain Morrison interjected with momentum that indicated development of assessment toward territory, where diplomatic convenience would prove inadequate for addressing tactical reality that demanded recognition of capability, regardless of political consideration about appropriate acknowledgement or institutional credibility. The precision techniques suggest systematic conditioning that required extensive time investment and specialized instruction. Alpha King Darius found himself confronting evidence that challenged his understanding of territorial arrangements, while revealing implications that extended beyond diplomatic convenience to encompass strategic necessity that might require different approaches than traditional authority had previously employed for maintaining order through established hierarchies and conventional control methods. "She was mine," he said with quiet intensity that carried weight of recognition rather than possessive claim, acknowledgement that transcended political consideration to encompass understanding that had been developing throughout assessment of evidence that challenged comfortable assumptions about capability and appropriate distribution of lethal potential within territorial boundaries. The declaration hung in forest air that had been transformed from crime scene into revelation that challenged fundamental assumptions about recent diplomatic arrangements and their consequences for territorial balance through introduction of factors that operated beyond normal calculation about power and its appropriate exercise through force rather than negotiation. "Your Majesty?" Commander Hayes asked with uncertainty that reflected growing comprehension that royal response to evidence suggested knowledge that exceeded immediate tactical assessment, understanding that possessed different context than military analysis could provide through observation of elimination patterns and professional techniques. "Project Shadowblade," the Alpha King replied, with tone that mixed professional acknowledgement with personal recognition of loss that had shaped territorial security through methods designed to serve royal protection while eliminating threats that operated beyond conventional defensive capability or traditional authority that governed normal territorial arrangements and diplomatic relationships. Initiated 7 years ago to develop individual whose capability would transcend normal limitations through conditioning that served strategic objectives while eliminating personal attachments that might compromise operational effectiveness through emotional interference or moral consideration about appropriate methods for achieving tactical objectives. The revelation transformed evidence from crime scene into confirmation of success that had been achieved through methods that required systematic destruction of original identity while preserving functionality that served royal protection through lethal capability that operated beyond normal territorial assessment or diplomatic calculation about appropriate power distribution. She was eliminated during extraction that required elimination of personal attachments, he continued, with explanation that revealed administrative decisions that had shaped territorial arrangements through methods designed to prevent complications that might arise from individual whose conditioning had achieved objectives while creating variables that exceeded normal control through emotional connections or community relationships. Memory suppression was implemented to prevent psychological complications while preserving operational capability. Captain Morrison observed, with professional understanding, that processed royal explanation through military assessment of conditioning techniques that serve strategic objectives while eliminating factors that might compromise effectiveness through personal consideration or moral interference. But conditioning that operates through muscle memory cannot be completely eliminated, Alpha King Darius confirmed, with recognition that had been building throughout assessment of evidence that demonstrated preservation of training, despite administrative attempts to manage capability through controlled placement and diplomatic arrangement. that served territorial convenience. Around them, forests that had witnessed systematic elimination served as backdrop for recognition that challenged comfortable assumptions about diplomatic success and appropriate resolution of territorial disputes through methods that honored political convenience over practical consideration about variables that exceeded normal calculation through introduction of factors whose significance ended immediate tactical situation. "Orders, Your Majesty?" Commander Hayes asked with military efficiency that attempted to balance tactical necessity with royal authority, whose decisions would determine appropriate response to individual whose capability challenged territorial security through demonstration of conditioning that served different objectives than current diplomatic arrangements or established hierarchies. "Find her," Alpha King Darius commanded with intensity that reflected transition from diplomatic consideration to strategic necessity that honored capability over political convenience while recognizing value that transcended territorial agreement or community arrangement through systematic conditioning that had achieved objectives beyond normal assessment parameters. "She represents strategic asset that cannot be replaced through conventional training or community instruction," he continued with analysis that processed tactical evidence through understanding of conditioning requirements and systematic education that had shaped Omega gentleness into lethal effectiveness through methods that served royal protection while eliminating limitations that typically governed individual capability. Furthermore, he added with momentum that carried assessment toward recognition of implications that extended beyond immediate tactical situation. Her conditioning was designed to serve royal protection rather than territorial integration. Her loyalty operates according to different programming than diplomatic arrangement would have provided through community placement or social instruction. The systematic presentation of strategic assessment revealed complexity that surrounded individual whose capability challenged territorial balance, while serving objectives that transcended normal diplomatic calculation or political convenience that had shaped recent arrangements through methods designed to resolve disputes without introducing variables that exceeded control through conventional authority. As teams prepared for pursuit that would test whether royal authority possessed sufficient understanding of conditioning to locate individual whose training had been designed to operate beyond normal tracking capability, Alpha King Darius found himself confronting consequences of administrative decisions that had prioritized political convenience over strategic necessity while eliminating assets whose value transcended territorial arrangement. The forest that had witnessed demonstration of lethal capability would soon become hunting ground where royal authority would attempt to reclaim weapon, whose loyalty had been compromised through betrayal, while capability remained intact through conditioning that served different mathematics than diplomatic submission or community integration had been designed to achieve through conventional method. Depth. Behind evidence that revealed systematic elimination of professional patrol, territorial balance had been destabilized through introduction of factor whose significance exceeded diplomatic calculation, while demonstrating that some transformations created variables that operated beyond administrative control through conditioning that preserved effectiveness regardless of political convenience or immunity arrangement. The abandoned tribute had become strategic asset whose capability challenged established order while serving objectives that transcended normal territorial authority, weapon whose loyalty would be determined through recognition rather than diplomatic arrangement that had failed to account for conditioning that operated beyond normal assessment parameters through training that honored effectiveness. This over political consideration. In growing recognition that tactical situation required different approaches than conventional authority had previously employed, Alpha King Darius prepared for confrontation that would test whether royal understanding of conditioning exceeded territorial calculation about appropriate methods for managing capability that challenged established hierarchies through demonstration of lethal potential, that served strategic rather than diplomatic objectives. The reckoning that had been delayed through administrative convenience was finally beginning, carrying forward momentum that would determine whether political arrangement could contain weapon, whose conditioning transcended normal limitation through systematic education that had preserved royal protection, while eliminating factors that might compromise effectiveness through emotional consideration or moral interference with tactical necessity. Some weapons required recognition to function according to original programming, and her conditioning had been designed to serve royal authority through methods that transcended territorial loyalty or community attachment, while preserving lethal capability that operated beyond normal assessment through training, that honored strategic objectives over diplomatic convenience or political stability. Hat governed conventional arrangements. 6 months later, the royal training compound existed beyond normal territorial boundaries, in spaces where strategic necessity transcended diplomatic consideration. Facilities designed for development of capabilities that served kingdom-wide security through methods that operated beyond conventional military instruction to encompass specialized conditioning that honored effectiveness over politica. Convenience or traditional limitations that governed standard defensive arrangements. Commander Kira Shadowblade stood before assembled trainees, whose development reflected transformation from normal territorial recruitment to specialized program that honored demonstrated capability over inherited status, while her presence served as visible reminder that lethal effectiveness could be achieved through systematic education that transcended typical limitations imposed by social expectations or community instruction designed for integration rather than strategic application. Her restoration of identity had required months of careful reconstruction that balanced recovery of personal history with preservation of conditioning that had been achieved through systematic education, process that honored individual worth, while maintaining capability that served royal protection through methods that operated beyond normal diplomatic calculation or territorial arrangement. Desai. Milt for political convenience. The Shadowblade Protocol has been implemented throughout the Eastern Territories. She reported to Alpha King Darius with satisfaction that reflected systematic changes that had emerged from recognition of capability rather than continued concealment through administrative convenience or diplomatic arrangement that prioritized political stability over strategic necessity and appropriate acknowledgement. Degement of lethal potential. Selection processes now emphasize demonstrated loyalty and proven capability under extreme pressure rather than political connections or inherited status that previously determined advancement according to social expectations rather than tactical requirements for protection that served royal security through effective rather than ceremonial methods designed for appearance over functionality. The comprehensive approach had transformed royal protection from system based on traditional hierarchies to organization that honored merit, while maintaining appropriate standards for personnel whose responsibilities included elimination of threats through methods that balanced institutional dignity with recognition of conditioning that served strategic objectives beyond normal diplomatic calculation or community arrangement. Throughout territories where royal authority extended beyond ceremonial recognition to encompass practical protection of populations whose security depended on capability rather than political convenience, communities had learned about transformation that honored effectiveness over comfortable assumptions about appropriate power distribution and legitimate sources of strength that preserved established order through systematic rather than random application of force. The response from allied kingdoms has exceeded expectations. Commander Shadowblade continued with professional assessment that reflected broader implications of policies that had emerged from individual recognition rather than continued administrative concealment, while international attention suggested growing acceptance of approaches that balance diplomatic necessity with honest acknowledgement, and of strategic capabilities that operated beyond normal territorial calculation. 7 territories have requested guidance about developing similar programs that prioritize demonstrated capability over inherited privilege, while establishing recognition protocols that honor service through acknowledgement rather than concealment when outcomes challenge preferred narratives about institutional strength and appropriate sources of royal security through conventional rather than specialized methods. The diplomatic success indicated that honesty about capability and strategic necessity served political objectives more effectively than concealment that required systematic deception, while international recognition provided validation for approaches that balance security requirements with ethical principles about appropriate treatment of individuals whose conditioning served protection through personal sacrifice that demanded acknowledgement rather than erasure. Alpha King Darius approached with expression that mixed royal satisfaction with personal recognition of relationship that had been restored through choice rather than administrative arrangement, authority that honored individual worth while acknowledging strategic value that transcended normal diplomatic calculation about appropriate utilization of specialized capability for kingdom-wide security, that protected populations through effective rather than ceremonial methods. "Commander," he said with formality that honored professional relationship, while his tone carried personal warmth that reflected bond forged through recognition of conditioning that had been preserved despite administrative attempts to manage capability through controlled placement and diplomatic convenience that prioritize political stability over strategic necessity. Your training programs continue to demonstrate that systematic education can develop capability that exceeds traditional limitations. He continued with analysis that honored individual achievement, while acknowledging broader implications for territorial security that operated through recognized rather than concealed effectiveness. While your recovery provides evidence that identity can be restored without compromising operational functionality that serves protective objectives. Their conversation reflected understanding that had been developing throughout months, when individual transformation had inspired institutional changes that honored capability over convenience, while maintaining appropriate standards for royal protection that served kingdom-wide security through methods that balanced effectiveness with recognition of human worth and personal dignity. The memorial protocols have been implemented as well, she observed with satisfaction, that spoke of systematic changes that honored individual sacrifice through permanent acknowledgement rather than administrative erasure, policies that prevented future concealment of contribution, that served royal protection through personal cost, that demanded recognition rather than convenient forgetting design. Ed for political comfort. Every operative who serves strategic objectives through specialized conditioning receives acknowledgement by name and mission contribution, while their families receive recognition that honors service rather than accepting diplomatic fiction about training accidents or administrative reassignment that concealed actual circumstances, and appropriate gratitude for protection that preserved royal authority. The comprehensive approach to recognition had established precedent that prevented systematic erasure while providing families with truth about sacrifice, rather than comfortable lies that served administrative convenience over human dignity, and appropriate acknowledgement of loss that had shaped their circumstances through individual choices that honored strategic necessity over personal comfort or safety. Throughout the compound, where specialized training continued according to principles that balanced capability development with preservation of individual identity, trainees learned that effectiveness could be achieved without systematic destruction of personal worth, while conditioning served protective objectives through methods that honored both strategic necessity and human dignity that operate beyond administrative calculation. The integration process has shown remarkable success rates, Alpha King Darius observed, with assessment that honored systematic approaches to capability development while acknowledging lessons that had been learned through individual experience with conditioning that had preserved functionality, despite administrative decisions that prioritized convenience over appropriate recognition of human woe. Earth. Trainees who maintain personal identity throughout specialized education demonstrate superior performance compared to previous protocols that required systematic erosion of individual characteristics. He continued with analysis that processed evidence through strategic understanding that balanced effectiveness with ethical principles about appropriate methods for achieving royal protection through human resources that deserved recognition rather than exploitation. Furthermore, loyalty that emerges through choice rather than conditioning demonstrates greater reliability under extreme circumstances while maintaining flexibility that serves strategic objectives through adaptive responses rather than rigid programming that might prove inadequate when facing unexpected threats or novel tactical situations, requiring creative rather than predetermined solutions. The systematic presentation revealed institutional learning that honored individual worth while acknowledging strategic necessity, approach that balanced protection requirements with ethical consideration about appropriate treatment of personnel, whose conditioning served royal security through methods that preserved human dignity while achieving lethal effectiveness that transcended normal limitations. As evening settled over training facilities that had been transformed from spaces designed for systematic destruction of identity into environments that honored individual worth while developing capability, Commander Shadowblade found herself reflecting on a journey that had led from abandonment through systematic elimination to recognition that restored identity while preserving conditioning that served protective objectives. The betrayal that had shaped her circumstances through diplomatic arrangement, designed to eliminate problematic individual, had ultimately revealed strength that transcended normal limitations, while systematic conditioning that had been designed to destroy personal identity had preserved capability that served strategic objectives, despite administrative attempts to manage effectiveness through controlled placement, and political convenience. But perhaps most importantly, her restoration had proven that identity and capability could coexist when conditioning honored individual worth, rather than requiring systematic destruction of personal characteristics, that loyalty could be achieved through recognition, rather than programming, and that effectiveness increased rather than diminished when personnel maintained connection to human principles that governed appropriate treatment and mutual respect. "The pack that abandoned me," she observed with tone that mixed personal reflection with professional assessment, "continues to struggle with territorial security through conventional methods that prove inadequate for current threat environment, while their diplomatic arrangement gained them temporary peace at cost of strategic asset, whose value they failed to recognize until demonstration revealed actual capability." "Justice," Alpha King Darius replied, with understanding that honored individual experience, while acknowledging broader principles about appropriate treatment and legitimate consequences for decisions that prioritize political convenience over human worth, operates through outcomes that reflect authentic value rather than political calculation about expedient disposal of individuals whose circumstances become inconvenient. Around them, training facilities that served kingdom-wide security through development of specialized capability continued operations that honored both strategic necessity and human dignity, while their success demonstrated that effectiveness and ethics could operate according to principles that served protection through recognition rather than exploitation of personnel whose conditioning preserved royal authority through methods that balanced capability with individual worth. In growing darkness that concealed training exercises while revealing commitment to protection that operated beyond normal diplomatic calculation, the woman who had been abandoned as tribute discovered that recognition could restore identity while preserving conditioning that served strategic objectives through choice, rather than administrative arrangement designed for political convenience over human dignity. The forest that had witnessed systematic elimination would be remembered as location, where weapon had demonstrated capability that transcended normal assessment while revealing conditioning that served different mathematics than territorial arrangement had been designed to achieve through diplomatic convenience that failed to account for variables whose significance exceeded political calculation. Her story had begun with betrayal disguised as diplomatic necessity, continued through demonstration of conditioning that challenged territorial assumptions, and culminated in recognition that honored capability while restoring identity through methods that served strategic objectives without requiring systematic destruction of human worth or individual dignity that operated beyond administrative convenience. The Royal Training Compound stood as testament to institutional learning that honored individual sacrifice while developing capability that served kingdom-wide protection through methods that balanced effectiveness with ethical principles, demonstration that systematic conditioning could achieve lethal capability while preserving human dignity through recognition rather than exploitation of personnel, whose service demanded acknowledgement of worth that transcended political calculation or administrative convenience. Some weapons required recognition to function according to original design, and her conditioning had been achieved through methods that honored individual choice, despite systematic education that had shaped capability beyond normal limitations, while preserving identity that served strategic objectives through loyalty earned, rather than programmed through administrative arrangement that prioritized convenience over authentic relationship between authority and protection, that preserved systems through human sacrifice, that demanded recognition rather than concealment. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.